Now, in times of war, crisis, and disaster, it can be hard to find any optimism, but our next guest urges us not to give up. Author Lizzie Wade's new book, Apocalypse, retraces human history, reflecting on human resilience and the ability to rebuild after experiencing catastrophe. From the Black Plague to the COVID pandemic, she tells Hari Srinivasan that despite the pain and destruction, there are valuable lessons to be learned from this history.
Lizzie Wade, thanks so much for joining us. Your book is called Apocalypse, and you start the book out, saying life in the 2020s is not for the faint of heart. Climate change, a novel pandemic, state collapse, unexpected invasions, and brutal wars. It feels like history suddenly sped up, leaving us scrambling for a foothold. But you're actually kind of optimistic. What's the silver lining here?
Yeah, I think the silver lining for me researching this book, and one of the reasons I wanted to write it, was because however scared I am of what we're facing in the world today, I found it really heartening and encouraging that so many of our ancestors experienced very similar things, and not only experienced them, but adapted to them, survived them, and sometimes even came out better on the other side.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, I never thought, I like probably most people, when I hear the word apocalypse, I think of this, cataclysm, a disaster, that is something that people don't recover from, that was unexpected. But you actually really take the time to break down that there's different, first of all, types of apocalypses that can be caused by, natural events, human-made events, political events, all kinds of reasons. What was there a through line on what made societies successfully come out of it?
Yeah, I think when I was trying to decide on a term for this book, I wanted kind of a term that would encompass, just as you say, many different kinds of events, not just a limited natural disaster, but something more long-lasting, something more transformative. And that was really the key word for me, was a transformation. If the society that went into one of these events was very different than the society that came out of it, that for me counted as an apocalypse.
And you point out that there are very different reactions, and we can't necessarily predict how a society is transformed. You kind of juxtapose a couple of different societies, one in the Indus Valley, the Harappan civilization. Tell us a little bit about what happened to them, and then you kind of compare that to, Europe and the Black Death. Tell us.
Yeah, so Harappa was a society that began to collapse around 4,200 years ago and had existed about 800 years before that. It was part of a larger Indus Valley civilization. Harappa was one of the main cities. And when archaeologists study not only how the city was laid out and organized, but also the skeletons of the people who were buried there, they find that Harappa at its height was very cosmopolitan and very egalitarian. Like, there's no images of a king, there's no palaces. The grandest architecture and the most sort of investment in time and resources seems to go into public spaces that many different kinds of people could use. And we know from how how goods were moving around, trade routes, and also the isotopes of the people who are buried there, you can see people, grew up somewhere else and came to Harappa later in their life and ended up forming part of that society and dying there. But around 4,200 years ago, there's the monsoon cycle gets disrupted. So it's sort of equivalent to a drought. But this climate change made things really unpredictable in ways that they had never experienced before. And what we see in Harappa is a real increase in inequality. People who seem to be living outside of the city's walls start to become much sicker, suffer possibly violent deaths. The people living in Harappa after most people have left, also are sicker, seem to experience more violence throughout their lives. And I think for me, that was part of showing that, like, apocalypses really come for society's weak points, so probably, as egalitarian as Harappa was, there probably were social divisions that kind of get smoothed out in how archaeologists can see it today. Apocalypses really amplified or perhaps even created those social tensions that were going into it. And in the Black Death, something sort of different happened, which is in Europe, this horrifying disease swept through and killed potentially over half of all people in the matter of 4 or 5 years. And when you're coming out of that, it actually seems to increase equality and decrease inequality in what had been a very, very, very unequal feudal society. So with fewer workers available living to keep these, keep the farms running, keep the manor houses running, do the essential labor of society, these workers had a lot more agency, a lot more decision-making over their lives, a lot more bargaining power in the ways that we would think about it today. Of course, they had different vocabulary for these things and how they were thinking about living their lives. But you can see in the elite writing around this time, as well as the bones of the people who died after the Black Death, that it seems like the poorer classes, the working classes, were much healthier after this plague.
What's interesting about the book is you have these kind of scenes where you paint life in these societies. And, obviously these are composite characters. You weren't able to interview somebody 4,000 years ago, but you've based this on research from science that's available today. And that was really fascinating to me. I had no idea that archaeology has advanced to this level, or climate science, or all the different kind of fields, and how specific we can get to figuring out what life was like for a particular person whose bones or DNA we might be able to see today.
Yeah, archaeology has come by leaps and bounds in the last few decades, both in terms of the scientific techniques available to archaeologists, and sort of also in the frameworks they use to think about what they want to learn, what is interesting about a past society, what kinds of questions they can ask and want to answer. So, I mentioned the study of isotopes. So essentially, when you drink water in a certain location, the kind of chemicals of the minerals in the water become stored in your teeth. And as a child, when your teeth are growing, so if you can compare the isotopic signature in a person's teeth to the geological signature of the place where they died, you can see if a person migrated throughout their life. And I think that's just so fascinating. And I think, the questions that archaeologists want to answer have really expanded beyond, who is the king of this society and what great stuff can we find in this tomb, to much more about who were the regular people, what were their lives like, how are they affected by and interacting with their environment, with the political structure of their society, and when it comes to apocalypses, how they recovered afterwards.
You talk about kind of social transformations, and you highlighted one that happened in northern Peru. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in northern Peru, around 5,800 years ago or so, El Nino suddenly started happening. So El Nino is, we all know it today. It's this climatic phenomenon that affects everywhere in the world, although in northern Peru, it probably affects the most directly and severely. So most of the time, the Pacific Ocean along the coast of Peru is quite cold. It was once or twice a century. The ocean would suddenly become warm, and that would lead to a lot more water evaporating into the atmosphere, flash floods, rain, all the fish adapted to the cold ocean dying, and, kind of the environment would suddenly turn inside out. And this would happen over and over and over again. And I thought a lot about these people as, sort of similar, experiencing something similar to us, where we think we know what our local environments are like, what we have to do to adapt to them, what we have to do to live in them, what they provide for us, and having that suddenly disappear, and in the case of Peru, just become the complete opposite of what it usually is, and how much grief and confusion and, sadness and terror that might have it generated. But what I also saw, or what archaeologists have found, is that, the people living at this time were, we're living mostly in smaller groups, moving around, hunter-gatherers. And we might think that an apocalypse like that, suddenly unpredictable environment that would just fragment people even further and, make the fighting for territory or fighting for resources. But actually what archaeologists have found is that in the centuries and millennia after El Nino began, people really came together in a new way that they never had before, often in actually in the environments that El Nino was transforming by creating wetlands and, leaving behind a bunch of mud from landslides. And one of the very first huge monuments in Peru that would have taken the cooperation of hundreds or thousands of people to build was actually built from the mud left behind by these El Nino events. And I just thought maybe, what we're seeing is not an apocalypse pulling people apart, but really bringing them together in a way that, again, they may have never even imagined doing before.
You also asked the reader to look at Mexico City as an example of a post-apocalyptic civilization. Explain.
Yeah, so I've lived in Mexico City for over 10 years, and it was really one of the inspirations for this book because, I think Mexico City was born of an apocalypse, the conquest of the Aztec Empire by the Spanish Empire in 1521. So in the case of the Aztec Empire, it was an empire. There was a lot of resistance to their rule, a lot of inequality, and so, when the European invaders arrived, some of the Aztecs, long-term enemies allied with these newcomers and kind of used them as weapons, And, a lot of the story was actually driven by indigenous agency, indigenous history, indigenous politics that stretched back centuries before there was ever a European in Mexico, and that the Europeans themselves didn't always quite understand. And, so you have this really interesting, fascinating apocalypse and, short, only 3 or 4 years. And Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City's old name, is in rubble. It's being reconstructed from the stones, literally out of the rubble of this apocalypse. Mexico City is built and reborn. And, we're still suffering the consequences of that, right? So Tenochtitlan, the Aztec city, was built on a lake. There was an island and that the center of the city was on, and then there was all these farmlands and canals and artificial islands, and it was just a really kind of amphibious environment that the Aztecs had figured out how to do a lot about how to manage the water, how to live with the water. And when the Europeans arrived, destroyed all this hydraulic infrastructure in this devastating war. And then either just didn't realize or didn't want to rebuild it. They never quite managed to figure out how to live with the water as the Aztecs did, and they drained the lake, and that's left us, this huge mega city of over 20 million people, I think, kind of teetering on this pile of mud, and that creates devastating earthquakes, even though there are not that many faults close to Mexico City. And so, we're still suffering. The rainy season just started a few weeks ago here, and we're already there's floods every week, and it's been like this for 420 years and counting. And so it's we're still suffering very immediately the effects of colonialism and the decisions that were made during this colonial period. And, that's been a lot of there's been a lot of change in Mexican society as a whole because of the kind of communities that come together after these disasters. So I think, it's both a post-apocalyptic tragedy and a post-apocalyptic opportunity, right? And I think living every day with that kind of paradox and cognitive dissonance really made me think about apocalypses differently and made me want to write this book.
You also show us that there are kind of different scales of apocalypses, so to speak. On the one hand, look, in our lifetimes, a lot of people would consider the pandemic to be an apocalyptic event for them if they lost several members of their family. And they certainly, the entire world for a very small moment experienced lockdown. And, we had this kind of shared experience.
I mean, I think you can see in the pandemic story, particularly, and it's really reflected in what happened after the Black Death, a real resistance to cultural changes that were, ultimately necessitated by these diseases. And, and after the Black Death, they were passing laws up till 40 years after the pandemic, multiple generations at that point, trying to get the working class back in line, back accepting what, the the limited, poorly paid, poverty-stricken lives they had before. And, that you can see in the length of time of those laws just how long it takes for all of the ripple effects to play out. And I think for me, thinking about apocalypses, including the pandemic, which I really think we won't know, even potentially within our lifetimes, all the effects it's going to have on us personally and especially on our societies. But I think for me, thinking about apocalypses, one really important and often encouraging thing to consider is that apocalypses are moments when things that seemed impossible before suddenly become possible. And that doesn't mean that those things are necessarily an improvement. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily a tragedy. And I think a lot of people in a lot of different societies across human history have experienced apocalypses very differently depending on who they are in a society. So we talked about with the Black Death. But for the elites, it was a terrifying tragedy, not only the loss of life, but the loss of power and control. For the working classes, we don't have as many of their feelings written down, if any, but we can see them, refusing to accept this pre-plague status quo in the writings of the elite. So you can sort of see how people are having different experiences. And things that would have seemed impossible before are suddenly on the table, and everything is up for grabs after an apocalypse and even during sometimes. And I think that seeing these events not only as moments of loss, which they certainly are, but also as opportunities and doors that we can walk through into a world that we maybe couldn't even have imagined before. I think that brings me a lot of hope.
Lizzie Wade, author of the book Apocalypse. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.